I was coming back from Chicago to St. Louis on a Greyhound bus. It was a night trip. It was over 11 p.m. when we boarded. I was exhausted, had spent all day at a boring meeting of work, and just wanted to erase the bank. I grabbed a seat in the bottom, near the window, and the bus was a little empty, with that heavy silence, you know? Only the snoring of the engine was listened to and some snoring people sleeping. But as soon as I sat down, I noticed a strange mold smell, as if someone had left a wet cloth molding there for days. I thought it was the old upholstery of the bus, but the smell came very strong from the front bench, where an older woman with a beaten coat was sitting. She held a plastic market bag of those very thin, and seemed restless, stirring her feet non-stop. I didn't give much ball at first. I thought she was just nervous or something. But then she began to murmur very low, as if talking alone. I had a phone, but without music, so I could hear pieces of what she said, like, "has to be safe," and "I can't leave." It was a frantic voice, almost desperate, and it started to give me a cold spine. I tried to ignore, closed my eyes and pretended to sleep, but the smell of mold did not get out of the air, and her murmurs didn't stop. By so many, the bus stopped at a gas station, one of those quick stops to stretch his legs. I was dying to go down, but before I got up, I looked sideways and saw her stirring in the bag. Guys, I swear, she took a children's shoe out of there, all soaked, as if it had been taken out of a river. She kept looking at the intensity that froze me, as if that shoe was the most important thing in the world. My heart shot, and I could only think, what's going on here? I was paralyzed at the bank, trying to sue what I had just seen. The shoe was small, kind of a child of about 4 or 5 years, and was all damaged, with a half-cool sole and a grayish tone, as if he had been submerged for a long time. The woman held him with both hands, so tight that her nodes on her fingers were white. I couldn't look away, even though I knew I shouldn't be peering. The smell of mold got stronger, as if it came directly from that shoe, and my stomach rapped. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that she could have found it somewhere, but something in the way she looked at the shoe told me that there was more thing there. Then, out of nowhere, the bus gave a bump as I passed a hole in the road, and I almost fell off the bench. When I raised my head, she was staring at me. Her gaze was a mixture of fear and anger, as if I had invaded a secret that wasn't supposed to know. My heart almost came out my mouth, and I turned my face quickly, pretending to look out the window. The rest of the stop was a blur. I went down the bus just to take an air, but my legs were shaking. The gas station was deserted. There was only a weak light flashing in the parking lot and the driver smoking a cigarette outside. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman and the shoe. Why was she carrying that? And why did you seem so terrified? I went back to the bus with my head 1,000, and when I passed her seat, she was already there again with the bag on her lap, but the shoe was not in sight. I sat and tried to concentrate on my cell phone, but couldn't. The smell of mold was still in the air, and now it seemed that it came from all sides, as if it had impregnated on the bus. I tried to hear her murmurs again, but she was quiet now, only stirring her fingers in the bag, as if holding something hard. Every minute that passed, I was more tense, with the feeling that something very wrong was happening there. The bus returned to the road, and the silence became even heavier. I was afraid to look ahead, afraid to cross her gaze again, but at the same time I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening. I tried to distract myself by looking out the window, but only saw darkness and the weak reflection of my own face on the glass. The smell of mold was no respite, and now it seemed that I was stuck to my clothes, my hair, everything. Suddenly, I heard a low noise, like a rustle, coming from her bench. It was like she's moving in the bag again. My heart shot, but I didn't have the courage to look. Instead, I was paying attention, trying to capture any sound. And then it came, a low murmur, almost a whisper, but this time it seemed that she was talking to someone. "You're there, okay? I know you," she said, in such a soft voice that she gave me chills. I froze with the feeling that she wasn't talking to herself, but with something I couldn't see. I tried to convince myself that it was just my head preaching pieces, that I was tired and imagining things. But then the bus went through a turn, and the light of a pole on the road illuminated the hallway for a second. By the corner of her eye, I saw her bag on the floor, half open, and I swear I saw something move inside. It wasn't the shoe, it was something else, something that seemed wet, shining in the light. My stomach rolled, and I shrunk on the bench, trying to take a deep breath not to freak out. Her murmur stopped suddenly, and the silence that came later was even worse. It was as if the air was heavier, as if something was watching me. I couldn't pretend it was all normal. My hand trembled as I held my cell phone, and I just thought how long it was missing to get to St. Louis. I looked at the clock. We still had 2 hours of travel. 2 hours that looked like an eternity. I was trying to calm down, repeating in my head that it was just a strange woman who had nothing much, but my body didn't obey. My heart beat so fast that I felt him around her neck, and my mouth was dry. I decided to put the headphones and turn on a song, anything to block that heavy mood, but before squeezing play, I heard a sound that made me stop. It was a splash, very low, as if a drop of water had fallen to the floor. I looked at the hallway and had a small puddle, shining in the weak light of the bus, right next to her bench. It made no sense. It was not raining, and no one had spilled anything. The smell of mold was unbearable, and now I was sure it came from that puddle. I tried to look at her bench without being obvious, but she was on her back, curved, as if hiding something. My instinct screamed for me to change places, but the bus was on the move, and I didn't want to draw attention. I was there, arrested, with the feeling that something very wrong was unfolding. Then, out of nowhere, she turned her head, just a little, and I saw the corner of her face by the reflection in the window. I can't explain, but it seemed wrong. Her skin was too pale, almost gray, and her eyes looked back, as if she had no life there. She didn't look at me straight, but I felt a shiver so strong that I almost dropped the phone. That's when I realized that the plastic bag was on the floor, and the shoe was outside, as if it had been thrown. But the worst was not the shoe. It was the puddle, which now looked bigger, as if growing up alone. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear I saw the water move, as if something was forming inside it. My breathing was short, and I held on the bench, trying not to panic. I tried to get someone's attention, but the few passengers were sleeping or distracted, and the driver was ahead, oblivious to everything. I was alone in that situation, and every second, the feeling that something was watching me was stronger. I couldn't take it there anymore, but I didn't have the courage to move either. Every noise on the bus, the engine, a creak, a coughing passenger, made me jump to the bench. The smell of mold was so strong that I felt him in my throat, as if swallowing something rotten. I tried to focus on the road outside, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything, and the reflection of the window only showed my scared face and the outline of her bench. Suddenly, I heard a new sound, a slow drag, as if something wet was being pulled on the floor. My heart stopped for a second, and I gathered all the courage I had to look at the corridor. The pool was even bigger, and now there was a thin trail of water, as if something had been dragged from her bench to the middle of the hall. The shoe was in the middle of it, and it seemed that the water was leaving it, as if he was leaking. My head shouted that this was not possible, but my eyes didn't lie. I wanted to scream, but my voice didn't come out. The woman was property now, head down, as if sleeping. But something about her seemed wrong, as if she wasn't alive. I can't explain, it was like the air around her was colder, denser. I tried to convince myself that it was just tiredness, that I was imagining things, but then the light of the corridor blinked, and for a second, I swear I saw a small shadow, kind of a child, crouched near the shoe. It was so fast that I blinked several times, trying to understand, but the shadow disappeared. The puddle of water was still there, shining in the weak light, and now I was sure it wasn't just water. It had a metallic smell mixed with the mold, like rust or something worse. My hand trembled so much that I could barely hold my cell phone, and I just thought about how I wanted the bus to arrive soon. It was less than an hour to St. Louis, but it seemed that time was stopped. I shrunk on the bench, praying that nothing else happened, but deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be so simple. I was on the edge, trying to take a deep breath not to freak out. The bus looked like a freezer now, the cold rising by the legs, even with the heater on. I looked at the clock on my cell phone. 1:43 a.m. We still had about 40 minutes to St. Louis, and every second it seemed torture. The smell of mold and rust was unbearable, and the puddle in the hallway kept growing, as if alive. I tried to look at anything other than the front bench, but my eyes came back to the shoe, which now seemed to float in the water, as if being insured by something invisible. The woman had not moved since she lowered her head, and that only worsened things. I didn't know if she was sleeping, passed out, or another thing. All I wanted to do was get out of that bus, but it was stuck there, with that horrible feeling that something was looking at me, even without me seeing anything. Suddenly, I heard a low sound like a sob from her bench. It was so weak that I almost thought it was my imagination, but then it came again, clearer, as if someone was crying. I lifted my head slowly, my heart in my mouth, and saw that she was shrugging, as if she was shaking. The hiccup became louder, but it didn't seem human. It was sharper, almost like a lament. My skin shivered whole, and I held on the bench so as not to scream. The plastic bag was on the floor, torn, and there was more things coming out of it, pieces of wet cloth like children's clothes, all soaked and with that rotten smell. The puddle in the hall was so big that I almost touched my foot, and I pulled my legs on the bench, afraid to touch it. Then, without warning, the light of the hallway turned completely, and the bus was in the dim light, only with the weak light of the headlights outside. In the dark, the sobs stopped, and the silence that came was worse than any noise. I felt something in the air, a pressure, as if the space had shrunk. My breathing was short, and I could only think I needed to be calm, that it would soon end. But then, I heard a whisper, very close to my ear, so clear that it seemed inside my head. "You saw her, don't you?" By the time I heard that whisper, my whole body crashed. It was a thin voice, almost childish, but with a tone that made me feel an emptiness in my chest. I looked at the sides, desperate, but there was no one near me. The woman was still in the front seat, immovable with her head down, and the other passengers looked alien, sleeping or looking at anything. The light of the hallway blinked again, and the puddle on the floor was larger, now with a trail that went to the bottom of the bus. The shoe was turned upside down, and I swear I saw a hand mark in the water, as if something had touched there. My heart was fired, and I could no longer think straight. I tried to convince myself that it was just tiredness, that my head was inventing things, but the cold in the air, the rotten smell, and that whisper did not leave my mind. I wanted to scream for the driver to stop the bus, but my voice was trapped, and I could only stay there, clinging to the bench, afraid to make any movement. Then, out of nowhere, the bus gave a sudden braking, and everyone shook on the benches. The driver shouted something about an animal on the track, but I barely heard, because my gaze was stuck in the front seat. The woman had raised her head, and now she was turned to the hall, staring at me again. Only this time, her face looked melted, as if the skin was dripping. The eyes were back, black, and her mouth was crooked, as if she was trying to talk, but couldn't. I let out a low moan, unintentionally, and she tilted her head, as if he had heard me. The puddle on the floor bubbled, like boiling water, and the smell of rust was so strong that I tanned my nose. The shoe was floating in the water now, and the wet clothes of the bag were scattered across the hall, as if something had torn everything. I didn't know what was happening, but every cell in my body shouted that it was not normal, that I needed to get out of there. The bus walked again, and she was still looking at me without blinking, with that face that didn't seem human. I couldn't look away from her, even though they want to close my eyes and pretend that none of that was happening. Her face seemed to change every second, as if the skin was undoing, and the black eyes shone in a way that made me want to vomit. My breathing was so fast that I thought I was going to faint. I tried to move, even if it was to change my seat, but my body didn't obey, as if something held me there. The puddle in the hall was almost leaning against my bench now, and the shoe seemed to be pulsed, as if I had a life of its own. The smell of mold and rust was so strong that my eyes watered, and I felt a weight in my chest, as if something was crushing me. Suddenly she opened her mouth, and a sound came out. It was not a cry. Not a cry. It was something guttural, like a dirty water gap. My head hurt just hearing, and I tanned my ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside me. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever felt in my life. So, as fast as it started, everything stopped. The light of the hallway returned to normal, the sound disappeared, and the woman simply was no longer there. The front seat was empty, as if she had never existed. The bag, the shoe, the wet clothes, everything was gone. The puddle in the hall was no longer there, and the smell of mold disappeared, as if someone had opened a window. I looked at the sides, confused. My heart still fired, but no one on the bus seemed to have noticed anything. The other passengers were the same way, sleeping or stirring the cell phones, and the driver kept driving, as if nothing had happened. I was shaking with sweaty hands, trying to understand what had just lived. I looked at the clock, 2:15. The bus was almost coming to St. Louis, and I was never so relieved in my life. But at the same time, a part of me knew that what I saw was not just imagination. I felt her, or something, still watching myself, even with the empty bank. When the bus finally stopped at the bus station, I practically ran to get down without looking back. I am a student at a community college in Seattle, and I live in Tacoma. That day, it had been late at the library ending a job, and when I arrived at the station, the last train had gone. There was no way. I grabbed a regional bus that came out about 11 p.m. I was exhausted with a headset, looking out that I-5 pitch with a thick fog covering everything. The bus was almost empty, just me, a lady sleeping in front, a cab in the background, and the driver, who looked in a bad mood. I just wanted to get home, take a shower, and sleep. But suddenly the bus started to make some strange noises like a squeak and stopped out of nowhere in the middle of the road. The driver cursed loudly, talking about bad wiring, and was trying to fix it. My heart has already accelerated because seriously, standing on a deserted highway at night is not cool at all. As the driver moved on the panel, I was looking out outside, trying to see something in the mist. That's when I saw two figures approaching the road. They were two teenagers, type 16 or 17, wearing hood, and they started knocking on the bus door tightly. I froze. They were shouting with the downside, something about an accident in front, and begging for the driver to return. One of them, which I could see better, had a pale face, almost shining in the weak light, and the wide eyes, as if he had seen something horrible. You woke up scared, and the cab started to grumble that it was just a trot. The driver also thought it was a joke and shouted for them to leave without opening the door. I didn't know what to think, but those boys really seemed desperate. Suddenly they stopped hitting, looked at the bus once last, and simply disappeared in the mist, as if they had been swallowed by her. My stomach wrapped it, and I felt a cold that I didn't explain. After the boys disappeared, the silence on the bus was heavy. The driver mumbled a little more, moved some buttons, and the engine finally got it again. He said everything was fine, but I realized he was a little restless, looking at the rearview mirrors all the time. I was stuck to the window trying to see if those teenagers were still there, but the mist was so dense that it could barely see the road. My heart was hitting hard, and I couldn't stop thinking about those boys, the way they screamed. There was something wrong, something that gave me a tightness in my chest. The lady in front was praying softly, holding a third, and the cap only swung his head, as if he tried to convince himself that it was nothing. I took my cell phone out of my pocket, but the sign was terrible, and the battery was almost over. I tried to calm down, thinking that maybe it was just tiredness making me imagine things, but that cold in the spine wasn't leaving. A few minutes later, the bus began to walk slower, as if the driver had stepped on the throttle. He said nothing, just looked forward, his hands squeezing the steering wheel. Suddenly, I saw some lights flashing in front, half blurred by the mist. I thought it could be a police car or an ambulance, but when we got closer, there was nothing. Nothing at all. Only the empty road, with those lights disappearing as if they had never existed. I felt a shiver